All right, you guys, the listing count just took a surprising dip. We have been following active listings and new listings, not only here in Phoenix, but nationally throughout the year. And we've just seen an increase of homes on the market. The inventory has continued to go up. That has played very well in the buyer's favor and not as much in the seller's favor. But it looks like things are taking a turn, and it's not just here locally. We're seeing some of this in other areas of the country as well. So let's take a look at our active listings this week. We're starting to see this trend downward. Now, today we're at 26,129 active listings on the market. Last week, 26,637. The week prior, 26,708. So every week, even though it's kind of hard to see, it's been just a slight downward trend, but this week is pretty obvious. Now, of course, we are much higher than where we've been previous years in terms of our active inventory, but we had been climbing pretty consistently and adding to our active listings this whole year, and now the trend is changing. Is this surprising? Not necessarily, because as we get into June and July and the summer, we tend not to add so many new listings to the market. And, it's a little bit of a slower time, but with the trend that we had been seeing and kind of going against the seasonal norms here in Phoenix, this is a little bit surprising. Now, I think sellers are kind of throwing in the towel a little bit because they're witnessing what's going on with the active listings currently. And if they don't actually have to sell, they're maybe not willing to take the chance of putting their home on the market, especially as we get into a slower time of the year anyway here in Phoenix. So I think we're seeing a little bit of that. Plus, I'm going to share with you some of the crazy things buyers are starting to ask for from the Cromford report. And, in my experience, I have seen the same, maybe not these exact items, but I've definitely seen some buyers getting a little bit more bold in what they're asking for from sellers. And so I think it comes down to, if you don't have to sell, then you're not going to deal with it. Now, the difference between today and 2008 is that we had a lot of desperate sellers in 2008 that actually did have to sell. And in today's environment, yes, we have seen a lot of active listings. We've seen a lot of inventory, but sellers are kind of like, nah, I don't need to do this. And they are backing off a little bit. We can see that in the data with listings that were canceled. So in May, we saw 2,134 listings canceled. That's the highest number we've seen so far this year. You can see that trend has been climbing since the beginning of the year. We've also seen listings that have expired continue to increase. This is showing June, so far we don't have a whole lot of data for that. But looking at the year, just similar to canceled listings, we're seeing the same with expired listings. Every month, we've seen more and more listings expire off the market. So this is indicating that we don't really have desperate sellers. We just have sellers that are not succeeding and just kind of deciding it's not worth it. Now, we looked last week at the number of new listings by month. We've been tracking this every single month this year, and we can see that last month we just barely beat out the past 2 years in terms of new listings added to the market. This month so far, we're at 1,870. I'm going to bet we do not beat last year's numbers this year. I think this is going to be the breaking point of our new listings by month this year. We're finally going to break the trend, but we have a little ways to go to see if that is a correct forecast. So like I said, that's not just here in Phoenix, but Redfin published an article as well. Some would-be home sellers are stepping back as market tilts towards buyers. They're saying new listings of U.S. home sales rose 6.3% year over year during the 4 weeks ending June 1st, one of the smallest increases of the last 3 months. New listings declined year over year in 11 of the 50 most populous metros, with the biggest drops in San Jose and a lot in Florida, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, Tampa, and West Palm Beach. Beach. They're saying that when we look at the recent weeks, new listings fell the second half of May, and it's typical to see a slight drop off then, but this was the biggest drop they've seen for this time period in a decade. Now, a lot of this, like I said, is because sellers don't have to sell and they're tired of dealing with a difficult market. Prospective buyers are backing off because housing costs are near record highs, with the median home sale price up 1.2% year over year, the weekly average mortgage rate approaching 7%, and the U.S. economy is unpredictable. So that's a little bit of what's going on in the mind of the buyer, and therefore buyers aren't really coming out in droves to, soak up these listings, and sellers are having challenges getting them sold at the price that they want. They're saying while there are hundreds of thousands more home sellers than buyers in the market, we talked about this last week. I shared the article where sellers are outpacing home buyers by a large amount right now, and new listings are still rising. The recent decline in listings suggests some of the spring's would-be sellers are backing off. The typical home now sells for about 1% less than its asking price, the biggest discount for this time of year since 2020. So while many people have listed their home this spring, it seems like a lot of sellers are kind of running out of steam. If they don't absolutely have to sell, they're not interested in taking a lower price in order to do so. So they're either canceling the listing or letting it expire off the market. If you're someone who's been considering selling your home, and maybe you really actually do need to sell your home and really just curious of what your value could be, check the description below. I have a link for an instant home valuation that'll give you some idea of what that would sell for. Now, in some good news, we have consumer housing market sentiment hits 2025 high point. Nearly 30% of consumers say they expect mortgage rates to decrease in the coming year. I find that an interesting perspective. They're saying that the consumer sentiment towards the housing market improved in May, reached its highest level since November of 24. Fannie Mae's home purchase sentiment index rose 4.3 points to 73.5 last month, driven by increased optimism about the home buying and selling conditions and expectations that mortgage rates may fall in the coming year. They said that the index remains below pre-pandemic highs, but is recovering from an all-time low of 56.7, which was recorded in October of 2022. If you remember from that time frame, that's really when the brakes were slammed on with the market after interest rates went super high compared to what we were used to, and everything kind of came to a halt. So we have recovered since then, but the sentiment is still not as high as it was pre-pandemic. As for rates, they say 29% of consumers say they expect rates to decrease. 38% expect them to remain unchanged. The share of respondents who think rates will rise fell from 36% in April to 32% in May. So not a huge change there, but there now are fewer people that are thinking rates are going to rise. One of the big things that we've been talking about is the labor market. They say concerns about job security also eased. Only 22% of employed respondents said they were worried about losing their job, which is down from 25% in April and 32% in March. Now, while this is just a survey and not necessarily getting a great idea of where everyone is at, it does give some indication that maybe sentiment truly is on the upward swing despite the labor market, rates, inflation, and home prices all together. So let's talk about what's going on with rates. Mortgage rates a hair lower to start the week. That was at the beginning of this week. Friday's big rate spike did not carry additional momentum into the new week. We saw that last Friday. And this is a big risk when rates are responding to surprise in the jobs report, but slightly less of a risk when other economic data had been weaker. So all in all, no significant economic reports or news headlines to inspire volatility, although afternoon headlines regarding progress on trade talks with China could result in bonds losing some ground. So maybe a quieter week this week for rates. We shall see. Where we're at today, roughly for 30-year fixed, 6.95, still just hanging around 7%, not too much of a change on rates. But if you are out there talking time with your mortgage lender, just make sure you stay in touch with them in case there are any big swings one way or the other. Now, I thought this was really interesting. You hear me talk a lot about assumable mortgages on this channel because it is such an amazing opportunity, but they aren't always the easiest to find. But there is something called retro rate, which is going to be coming out. They're being funded right now. It's going to fuel an assumable mortgage tool set. Retro rate pulls from MLS listings, county property records, and historic interest rate data. It's a startup focused on making assumable mortgages easier to find and evaluate. It's raised $2.2 million in seed funding. This will also allow real estate agents to find assumable loans through MLS data and guides them through a complex approval and closing. So this is kind of exciting. If we get some more resources for assumable loans, I will definitely be taking advantage to share that with my clients. A lot of times what our team does is exactly what this retro rate is going to be doing in the future with much more ease. We're just a little bit more manual, wherein kind of scraping those tax records to find out which homes could potentially have assumable mortgages and cross-referencing that with what is actually listed. So there is a lot of legwork that goes into that. And unfortunately, right now, there aren't a whole lot of resources out there that you can truly depend on showing you everything that could potentially be assumable. Now, if you're not familiar with this process, it basically means when you're buying a house, you can assume the mortgage at the rate and payment from the seller, which is a huge opportunity if the seller has a rate that's like 3% and a mortgage payment that is associated with that. So it kind of allows you to go back in time to get a lower mortgage payment, assume the loan balance from the seller, and then pay off the difference between that loan balance and the sales price. If you're interested in learning more about that, I have an assumable loan guide linked below. I also have a list of homes with assumable mortgages if you want to check that out as well. Now, buyers, getting a little crazy out there. Let's hear what they have been asking for lately. Before I get there, if any of this is helpful for you, consider subscribing or share this video with someone who would find it helpful. I'd love to have you all join my community going forward every week with these market updates. So listing agents have shared that buyers have asked for the following: the interior to be completely repainted. Now, of course, all of this is probably part of that inspection process. And typically with inspections, we are asking the sellers to make repairs of things that are maybe health and safety focused, maybe something that really has to do with the integrity of the home, the major systems, reasonable things where I don't want to buy a house if this is broken, right? But repainting the entire interior, I feel like is a big ask. Whether or not these sellers agreed to it, I don't know. All windows to be replaced, all windows to be tinted, and a new roof even when the old roof is not leaking, new AC unit when the current one is working, although it's older, bathroom to be remodeled. That's a big one. I wonder if they said yes to that. And closet to be reframed because it was not perfectly rectangular. Very interested on how that all came to fruition. But buyers are getting crazy out there. So sellers, be prepared. Even if you do get under contract and inspection takes place, you never know what they're going to ask for. Now, of course, you have the right to say no. Whether or not they want to proceed after you say no to their demands, that's the risk you're taking there. Buyers certainly have more power than sellers in this market in almost every area of the valley. And in the areas that are more focused as a seller's market, those sellers still don't have as much leverage as they once did. So you really do have to be negotiating in this situation and kind of play it cautiously on the seller side for the most part. Otherwise, you do risk the buyer walking away because they do have a lot of options to choose from. So speaking of sellers markets, buyers markets, the Cromford Market Index is at 72.7 this week, which is definitely in a buyer's market. Anything under 90. Demand index has gone down slightly at 79.1, and the supply index actually went down 108.8. I think it was around 109 last week. So as we are seeing that active listing chart start to come down, that is also being reflected in our CMI as well on the supply index. So who knows? The CMI could start to strengthen a little bit if we see supply starting to come down and getting closer to demand. It'll be an interesting summer. We'll have to keep an eye on all of that. Now, if we look at every major city throughout the valley, this is their respective CMI. We only have a few cities that are truly in a seller's market and barely hanging on there. That's just Chandler, Avondale, and Fountain Hills. A lot of cities in a balanced market. And then again, below 90 is your buyer's markets. The overall change, the average month over month for all of these cities this week was negative 3.1%, which is less negative than last week. The month over month change had been negative 3.5%. So there is some, slowdown in this move towards a buyer's market, but we are still heading in that direction. The Cromford report is saying that at this current rate, supply is likely to fall slowly between June and August before we see the usual seasonal rise during the September to November period. So we'll see if that actually happens. I think they're probably right. We'll see supply continue to fall. And then as we get closer to the fall, maybe we'll see a little bit of a bump there before we end the year, kind of tapering off as we tend to do during that time frame. Now, I always like to look at the contract ratio as well because the Cromford Market Index is great, but the contract ratio really gives us the heat in every zip code all across the valley. And so most of these are green, which is balanced and warm. So somewhere between that 30 to 60 range. We do have some cities that are blue, which is a colder area. We see a little bit of that in Phoenix, some of that in North Scottsdale. But overall, seeing this balanced, warm market throughout the valley, which is not a bad thing, although it can feel like a major struggle as a seller. And I think a lot of buyers are seeing this as, a red alert. Sellers are desperate, and then they're asking for the moon and the stars. And therefore, we have sellers and buyers that are so far apart right now. And that also makes for a lot of things not moving and longer days on market, and eventually those cancellations and expired listings. So just remember, if you're a seller out there that doesn't have to sell, you're not the only one. You may just want to cancel your listing or allow it to expire if you're not getting the price that you want. For buyers out there, just know there may be some desperate sellers, but the majority of sellers are showing that they are not that desperate, and they likely aren't going to repaint the interior of the house for you because they just don't have to. So it'll be an interesting summer to keep an eye on everything as we see these listings slow down, and keeping tabs on prices as well, because those have come down as we started the year. So are we going to continue to see that? As a reminder, Redfin believes that prices are going to go down by 1% by the end of the year. So we'll keep an eye on if that's going to happen in Phoenix, whether that be more or less than Redfin's forecast, and how that is going to affect buyer demand. If you are curious about what the contract ratio looks like in your zip code, I also have a link below where you can request that information. I will see you guys next Wednesday on my next market update.